family, private property, and the free market are often presented as unshakable, almost divine pillars upon which the complex architecture of Western civilization rests. This triad is frequently invoked in discourses celebrating individual liberty, economic prosperity, and social order, painting a picture where these three elements function in synergistic harmony, guaranteeing the continuous advancement of humanity. Dominant narratives describe them not only as functional but as natural, almost as extensions of human biology or immutable laws of the social universe. There is little questioning of the genealogy of these institutions, how they evolved, the inherent tensions between them, and, crucially, the costs and exclusions that their hegemony may generate. Are they truly the only possible formula for peaceful coexistence and progress, or do they represent a specific historical configuration, with its own contingencies, biases, and blind spots? Challenging this monolithic view does not necessarily mean advocating for their abolition, but rather initiating a more honest investigation into their foundations, their mechanisms of perpetuation, and the full spectrum of their consequences, both the celebrated and the concealed. The naturalization of these structures often serves to obscure the power relations they sustain and the alternatives that have been marginalized throughout history. We ask, what if this sacred triad is less a divine revelation and more a human construct, subject to criticism, reconfiguration, and, who knows, transcendence? The very idea of foundation of civilization deserves scrutiny. What kind of civilization is being sustained, for whom, and at what cost? The family, as an institution, seems to be the most primordial, the most viscerally linked to our biological condition of reproduction and care for offspring. However, the specific form that the family assumes, nuclear, extended, matrilineal, patrilineal, is profoundly shaped by cultural, economic, and political factors. The image of the heteronormative nuclear family, often presented as the ideal and universal model, is, in fact, a relatively recent construct, linked to the rise of industrial capitalism and the separation between the public and private spheres. Before that, other family configurations were common and functional within their respective contexts. This specific idealization is not neutral. It carries with it a set of expectations about gender roles, the division of labor, and the transmission of wealth that conveniently align with the needs of labor force reproduction and capital concentration. The family thus becomes not only a space of affection and care but also a fundamental economic unit, and a primary vehicle for the socialization of individuals into the values and norms of the dominant society. It internalizes hierarchies, teaches obedience to authority, first paternal, then state or employer, and prepares individuals to accept inequalities as part of the natural order of things. The pressure to conform to this idealized model, even when it proves dysfunctional or unattainable for many, reveals how the family institution, under the guise of naturalness and affection, operates as a powerful mechanism of social control and the perpetuation of power structures. Questioning this model is not attacking love or care, but exposing how a specific form of family organization has been elevated to a pedestal, obscuring other possibilities of coexistence and mutual support. In parallel, the notion of private property, especially that of the means of production, has developed in a complex way. In many pre-capitalist societies, communal possession or land use based on collective needs and traditions prevailed. The transition to individualized private property, a process often violent and marked by expropriation, such as the enclosures in England, was justified by philosophers like John Locke based on the natural right derived from labor. By mixing one's labor with nature, the individual would make it their own. This justification, while elegant in theory, ignores the pre-existing conditions of collective use and the power relations that allowed some to accumulate vast properties while others were dispossessed. Once established and protected by the legal apparatus of the state, private property becomes the basis for capital accumulation and social differentiation. It confers not only material security but also political and social power to the owner. The intransigent defense of private property as an absolute right, almost synonymous with freedom, obscures the fact that the freedom to possess for some can mean the lack of access to essential resources for others. Property is not just a relationship between a person and a thing but fundamentally a social relationship, a system of rules that defines who has access and control over which resources, and who is excluded. The naturalization of this right, as if it were as fundamental as the right to life, prevents a deeper discussion about alternative forms of resource management that could promote greater equity and sustainability. What would a society where access to the means of subsistence was guaranteed, regardless of the possession of formal property, be like? This question, often considered utopian or dangerous, challenges the very foundation of the current economic order. The market, in turn, is presented as the neutral and efficient space where supply and demand magically meet to allocate resources in the best possible way, guided by the invisible hand of Adam Smith. This idealized view ignores the need for institutional preconditions, such as the guarantee of private property and the enforcement of contracts ensured by the state, and the asymmetries of information and power that distort perfect competition. The market is not a natural phenomenon that arises spontaneously but a complex social and political construction. Its expansion into spheres of life previously not commodified, health, education, culture, personal relationships, is a historical process known as commodification. Everything comes to have a price, and human value is often reduced to economic value. This mercantilist logic, although it may drive innovation and efficiency in certain sectors, can also corrode essential non-economic values, such as solidarity, mutual trust, and the common good. The incessant competition, celebrated as the engine of progress, also generates anxiety, insecurity, and exclusion for those who cannot win in the market game. The idea that the market is the final arbiter of value and truth masks the specific interests that benefit from this ideology and the negative social and environmental consequences that are often externalized, that is, passed on for society to bear. Thinking beyond the market does not mean eliminating every form of exchange but questioning its supremacy as the organizing principle of social life and exploring alternative mechanisms of economic and social coordination based on cooperation, democratic deliberation, and concern for collective well-being and ecological sustainability. The Triad, therefore, reveals itself to be less harmonious and more tense than its apologists suggest. The family molds the individual for the market. Property defines who can participate in it under advantageous conditions, and the market, in turn, pressures and reconfigures family structures and property relations. Delving deeper into the analysis of the family, one of the hidden mechanisms that sustains it as a civilizing pillar, especially in its patriarchal nuclear form, is the internalization of inequality as affection. From childhood, we are taught to accept hierarchies within the home, paternal authority, the division of tasks based on gender, as expressions of care, order, and love. This association between subordination and emotional well-being creates a powerful psychological block against challenging these structures. The child who learns to obey the father for their own good becomes the adult who more easily accepts the authority of the boss or the state without critical questioning. The very language of kinship is often co-opted to describe power relations outside the family: the father king, the motherland, the boss as a father, reinforcing this transfer of loyalty and submission. This dynamic is particularly effective because it operates at the most intimate and emotional level of identity formation. Challenging the traditional family structure can be perceived not as a search for greater equality or autonomy but as a betrayal of the deepest affective bonds, an attack on the very core of being. Furthermore, the family functions as a crucial buffer for the failures and hardships of the market and the state. It is within the family that many seek refuge from the unemployment, illness, loneliness, and insecurity generated by the economic system. By providing, or attempting to provide, this private safety net, the family alleviates the pressure on the state to provide universal and robust social services and masks the precariousness inherent in a market system that treats labor as a mere commodity. This buffer function is, paradoxically, what allows the capitalist system to continue functioning despite its inherent crises and contradictions. The family absorbs the shocks, takes care of the losers of the market, guarantees the reproduction of the labor force, often through the unpaid work of women, and all this under the guise of love and moral obligation, making exploitation and inequality more palatable. The mutual dependence created within the family unit, although a source of comfort, can also hinder individual mobility, and the challenging of social norms, trapping individuals in networks of obligations that limit their life choices. The romantic idealization of the family obscures these economic and social control functions, presenting it as an apolitical and purely affective refuge, when in reality, it is one of the main places where the power relations of the broader society are reproduced and negotiated daily. Breaking with this idealization requires recognizing the family as a political terrain, where affection and power, care and control, are inextricably linked. This opens space to imagine and construct forms of relationship and mutual care that are more egalitarian, flexible, and liberating, both within and outside traditional kinship ties. Returning to private property, a fundamental hidden mechanism for its legitimation is the conceptual fusion between property and personal identity. The idea that we are what we have is deeply rooted in consumerist culture. The possession of material goods, from clothes and gadgets to houses and cars, becomes a marker of status, success, and even intrinsic value as a person. This identification is constantly reinforced by advertising and the media, which associate products with desirable lifestyles, happiness, and personal fulfillment. Losing property, in this context, does not mean just a material loss but a threat to one's very identity, a kind of social death. This psychological connection makes the defense of private property an almost existential issue for many, hindering the consideration of alternative systems of possession or shared use. Another crucial aspect is the way the legal system and everyday language reify property, treating it as an almost autonomous entity with its own rights. We speak of protecting property, violating property, as if the thing itself had agency, obscuring the fact that property is, as mentioned, a set of social relations and rights defined and imposed by human beings. This reification masks the power relations and political choices behind the property rules. For example, the stronger legal protection granted to intellectual property, patents, copyrights, to the detriment of access to knowledge or essential medicines is not a technical or natural necessity but a political choice that benefits certain groups at the expense of others. The language of property rights sounds neutral and fair, but in practice, it codifies and legitimizes pre-existing inequalities in the access and control of resources. Furthermore, the very structure of modern property law, focused on the individual and the right to exclude others, hinders the management of common goods, such as the environment, shared knowledge, public spaces. The tragedy of the commons, often invoked to justify privatization, in fact describes the failure of an open and unrestricted access regime, not the failure of communal management itself, which historically has proven to be effective in many contexts when based on shared rules and norms. The insistence on individual private property as the only viable solution ignores this rich history of collective management and prevents the search for cooperative solutions to complex environmental and social problems. Dismantling this fetish of property requires, therefore, not only legal changes but a cultural transformation that dissociates human value from material possession and recognizes the interdependence and the need for collective management of the resources that sustain life in common. This implies valuing access over possession, use over accumulation, and shared responsibility over the exclusive right to exclude. Regarding the market, one of its most powerful hidden mechanisms is its ability to present itself as an apolitical and purely technical system of resource allocation based on objective laws of supply and demand. This depoliticization masks the fundamental political choices that structure the functioning of the market. Who defines the rules of the game, which goods and services can be commodified, and which should be protected from the logic of profit? How are the social and environmental costs of production and consumption distributed? By treating these issues as technical problems to be solved by experts or by the natural dynamics of the market itself, democratic debate about the values and objectives that should guide economic activity is avoided. The very notion of market efficiency is often defined narrowly, focusing on maximizing profit or GDP, ignoring other dimensions of human well-being and ecological sustainability. Another mechanism is the promotion of competitive individualism as the primary human motivation. The idea that we are all homo economicus, rational beings who seek to maximize their own interests, justifies fierce competition and inequality as natural and even desirable outcomes. This reductive anthropological view ignores the importance of cooperation, empathy, and altruism in human history and contemporary social relations. By elevating competition to the status of the main virtue, the market corrodes the bonds of solidarity and hinders the collective action necessary to face common problems. Advertising and consumer culture play a crucial role in this process, constantly, creating new needs and desires and associating happiness with the acquisition of goods. The work consumption cycle traps individuals on a treadmill, where they need to work harder and harder to maintain a constantly rising standard of living, leaving little time or energy for civic engagement, creative leisure, or mutual care. The promise of freedom through consumption proves illusory, as the freedom to choose between different brands of products masks the lack of control over working conditions, investment decisions, and the general direction of society. Furthermore, the globalized market creates production and consumption chains so long and complex that it becomes almost impossible for the consumer to track the social and environmental conditions under which products are made. This opacity allows the exploitation of labor and environmental degradation to occur far from the eyes of the final consumer, who can thus maintain a clear conscience while participating, involuntarily or not, in a global system of injustice. Challenging the hegemony of the market requires, therefore, repoliticizing the economy, bringing decisions about production, distribution, and consumption into the sphere of democratic debate. This implies strengthening institutions that operate with logics different from that of the market, such as public services, cooperatives, solidarity economies, and common goods, and cultivating a culture that values sufficiency, cooperation, and collective well-being above individual accumulation and incessant competition. The interconnection between family, property, and market creates a self-reinforcing system, where each element legitimizes and enables the others, forming a dense web that profoundly shapes individual and collective experience. The family, by socializing individuals to accept specific hierarchies and roles, prepares them to fit into the unequal structures of property and the market. Private property, by concentrating resources and power, defines the conditions in which families can, or cannot, prosper, and in which individuals enter the market. The market, in turn, with its logic of competition and commodification, pressures families to adapt to its demands. Geographical mobility, work schedule flexibility, double shift for women, and transforms property from a means of subsistence into an asset to be maximized. Financially, this triad, far from being a natural harmony, generates constant tensions and contradictions. The need for care and affection in the family sphere conflicts with the demand for efficiency and competition in the market. The right to property, celebrated as a guarantee of freedom, clashes with the need for access to common goods and essential services for the survival of all. The individual pursuit of security through accumulation in the market can lead to collective insecurity through financial crises or environmental collapse. However, the dominant ideology manages, most of the time, to present these tensions not as failures of the system but as individual problems of adaptation or as inevitable costs of progress. A crucial mechanism for maintaining this ideological cohesion, despite the contradictions, is the narrative of individual merit. The idea that success or failure in life is primarily the result of individual effort, talent, and choices obscures the role of social structures, the family of origin, access to property, opportunities, or lack thereof, in the market, in determining people's destinies. This meritocratic narrative justifies inequality as fair and natural, blames individuals for their difficulties. If you are poor, it's your fault, and discourages solidarity and collective action to change the structures. It functions as a powerful social analgesic, allowing people to tolerate high levels of inequality and precariousness without questioning the foundations of the system. Meritocracy, in this sense, is the ideological glue that holds the triad together, transforming structural privilege into personal virtue and systemic disadvantage into individual failure. Recognizing the fallacy of pure meritocracy is an essential step in dismantling the legitimacy of the social order based on the traditional family, unrestricted private property, and the unregulated market. This opens the way to thinking about forms of social organization that recognize human interdependence and seek to guarantee decent living conditions for all, regardless of their family origin, property ownership, or success in the market. Let us now consider the impact of this triad on individual and collective autonomy. Superficially, it is argued that private property and the free market expand the individual's freedom of choice, choosing where to live, what to buy, what career to pursue. The family, in turn, would offer the emotional and material support for the individual to exercise these choices. However, this optimistic view ignores how these same institutions can severely restrict autonomy. Economic dependence on the family, especially in contexts of absence of social protection networks, can limit life choices, forcing individuals to remain in abusive relationships or to follow professional paths they do not desire. Social norms and family expectations about marriage, children, and career can stifle individuality and authentic expression. The lack of access to property, land, housing, capital, drastically restricts the life options for the majority of the population, making freedom of choice in the market a mirage for those who struggle for daily survival. The labor market itself, with its demand for constant adaptation, long hours, and subordination to corporate hierarchy, limits the workers' autonomy over their time, their body, and their work process. The freedom to change jobs often boils down to the freedom to choose between different forms of exploitation or precariousness. Therefore, the autonomy promised by the Triad is, to a large extent, a formal and conditional autonomy. It exists for those who already possess the resources, economic, cultural, social, to exercise it, but it is severely limited for the rest. Market freedom ends up being, for many, the freedom to sell their labor power under unfavorable conditions. The freedom associated with property is the freedom of owners to exclude non-owners. Family security can become a golden cage that prevents individual development. This raises a dangerous question. Is the conception of freedom promoted by this triad inherently exclusionary and hierarchical? Does it confuse autonomy with possessive individualism and freedom, with the absence of restrictions for the already powerful? Collective autonomy, the capacity of a community or society to democratically define its own rules and priorities, is also undermined. The primacy of private property over the public interest hinders urban planning, environmental protection, and the implementation of redistributive policies. The logic of the market, by permeating all spheres of life, transforms citizens into consumers and political decisions into cost-benefit calculations, eroding the public sphere and the capacity for collective deliberation on the common good. The family, by closing in on itself as a private unit of consumption and affection, can weaken community ties and broader social solidarity. True autonomy, both individual and collective, seems to require not the sanctification of this triad but its relativization and its subordination to more fundamental principles of social justice, democratic equality, and ecological sustainability. Dismantling the negative effects of this triad does not necessarily mean seeking its complete destruction, which could lead to other forms of oppression, as some historical experiences have shown, but rather initiating a process of profound transformation and rebalancing of power. A fundamental strategy is denaturalization, constantly exposing the historical, social, and political character of these institutions, revealing the power relations they hide and the alternatives that have been suppressed. This involves critical historical research, sociological analysis, philosophical debate, and artistic expression that challenge dominant narratives. It is necessary to show how the traditional, family, sacred property, and the free market are specific constructions, with unequally distributed costs and benefits. Another crucial strategy is the strengthening of institutions and practices that operate with alternative logics. In the family sphere, this means supporting the diversity of family and cohabitation arrangements, promoting more egalitarian relationships within families, and creating networks of mutual support and care that transcend blood ties. It is about valuing care as essential work and a collective responsibility, not just a private, mostly female obligation. In the field of property, the strategy involves expanding the forms of collective and communal possession and management, cooperatives, communal lands, residents associations, strengthening the common goods, free knowledge, open source software, public spaces, protected natural resources, and limiting the excesses of private property through progressive taxation, land use regulation, and the guarantee of universal access to essential goods such as housing, health, and education. It is about reimagining property not as an absolute right to exclude but as a social responsibility to care and share. Regarding the market, the strategies involve democratic regulation to limit its power and direct it towards social and environmental ends, the expansion of non-commodified sectors, universal and quality public services, the promotion of the solidarity, cooperative, and small-scale economy, and the promotion of more conscious and sustainable consumption patterns. This implies challenging the logic of infinite growth and seeking economic models focused on human and planetary well-being. These strategies are not mutually exclusive and should be articulated at different levels: individual, community, national, and global. They require not only legal and institutional changes, but also cultural and psychological transformations, a change of values that prioritizes cooperation over competition, sufficiency over accumulation, care over domination, and the common good over private interest. It is a long and complex process, with no guarantees of success, but one that opens the possibility of building a civilization more just, free, and sustainable than that sustained by the sacred triad. The question is not whether we can live without family, property, or the market in some form, but whether we can shape them so that they serve the life and freedom of all, and not just a few. We have, therefore, reached a turning point. The in-depth analysis of the family property market triad reveals not a harmonious set of natural pillars but a complex system of historically constructed institutions, full of internal tensions, hidden mechanisms of power, and ambivalent consequences. We have seen how the family, under the guise of affection, can reproduce hierarchies and serve as a buffer for the hardships of the economic system. We observed how private property, justified in the name of individual freedom, functions as a powerful mechanism of social exclusion and concentration of power, dangerously merging with personal identity itself. We found that the market, presented as a neutral and efficient sphere, in fact operates according to politically defined rules, promotes a corrosive individualism, and expands its logic to non-economic domains of life, undermining individual and collective autonomy under the promise of freedom of consumption. The interconnection of these three elements, cemented by meritocratic ideology, creates a resilient system, capable of absorbing criticism and crises, but one that generates profound inequalities, insecurities, and limitations to the full human realization and the sustainability of the planet. The civilization that this triad sustains is, in many respects, a civilization of competition, exclusion, and unsustainability, despite the undeniable material advances that it has also provided to a portion of humanity. The sanctification of these institutions prevents an honest debate about their failures and the exploration of alternatives. The way forward does not lie in a simplistic rejection or an uncritical defense but in a radical redefinition of the relationship we establish with these spheres. It is about recognizing the family as a space of affection and care that must be democratized, freed from oppressive hierarchies, and open to multiple configurations. It implies conceiving property not as an absolute right to possess and exclude but as a form of access and responsible management of resources, prioritizing common use and the guarantee of decent conditions for all. It demands subordinating the market to democratic deliberation, limiting its sphere of influence, regulating its excesses, and fostering economic alternatives based on cooperation, solidarity, and respect for ecological limits. This redefinition is not a merely intellectual task but a continuous political and social practice, which is built in everyday life, in social struggles, in community experiences, and in conscious individual choices. It is an invitation to dismantle the hidden mechanisms that bind us to this triad as an inevitable destiny and to dare to imagine and collectively build other ways of organizing life in common, where freedom, equality, and mutual care are not just distant ideals but the true pillars of a civilization that deserves to be sustained. The journey is arduous, but the alternative, the perpetuation of a system that alienates us from ourselves, from others, and from nature, is unsustainable in the long run. The triad may have brought us this far, but to move towards a more human future, we will need to learn to walk beyond its shadow.